Hey everyone, thank you for joining me for part two of Enjoying a Diverse Career and Multiple Streams of Income with Dr. Steph Zhou. A quick housekeeping note before the interview. I'm not sure what's happening with beyondmdpodcast@gmail.com. That address has been somewhat volatile. Sometimes people's emails are reaching me late, and sometimes my responses are not going through. So if you are one of those people, I sincerely apologize. In the meantime, if you need to reach me, LinkedIn is the best and fastest way, and other social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram will work as well. So let's dive right into the interview. Now, I've also come across some companies who put other individuals or companies in touch with physicians for advice. And I think you mentioned that you will occasionally advise in an area that you are knowledgeable in, and you will be probably compensated for your time. I was about to do this as well, but then I found that sometimes, or often, I found that it became just a bit of a drain on my time. And although these companies would pay very competitive rates, honestly, I had a conversation with one company, and initially they were like, we routinely pay $150 an hour. But I said, well, one thing, while I understand that's your rate, you have to also understand that if you're pulling a physician out of their clinical responsibilities, then that clinician is foregoing clinical income. And so then they said, well, we're open to you setting rates. And I just threw out a number. I said like, okay, 500 an hour. And they're like, yep, we'll agree to it. And little did I know that they were actually implying that was going to be 500 American. So I didn't end up doing it because I found that for me, my time was just too valuable. But I want your take on advising. How does this work for you? And have you found this to be beneficial?
Yeah, like the way I kind of think about it is it's also kind of like being relevant and keeping on top of the newest developments in my addictions field. So likewise, for a lot of income streams, in the beginning, I did it for free to a lot of small startups just because they were like seed stage, single founder with an idea, app, or early product. And so for a lot of these companies, there were like no financials, nothing really quantitative you can go off of. And it was mostly just like providing some medical expertise, helping founders understand the climate in like addictions or mental health management. And how I kind of got into it was just, I happened to go to like tech events like TechTO, Elevate Fest, and it was just purely out of interest. And then through networking, that's when I started meeting investors in like VC funds, their analysts, startup founders, etc. And then I also remember meeting a physician advisor who he got his MD in the Caribbean, didn't end up doing a residency here, and he became an analyst at a VC fund, and then he called it a residency in VC. So I thought that was a very interesting way of putting it, because that's kind of how he developed that career further. In terms of, I guess, the rates, it does vary. So you mentioned in the US, and definitely US, they pay a lot more.
Yeah.
But here in Canada, we see whether it might be equity in the company, which is like ownership, like a very small ownership portion of the startup. But this you have to be a little bit careful of, because it could also not be worth very much if the company doesn't exit. And some startups, as you mentioned, they offer like actual money, which is, I would say in Canada, it's lower. So you're looking at maybe like $100 to $400 per hour. But some doctors can just charge them their clinical hourly rate. So whatever they throw out could just be what they're making, equivalent to what they're making in their actual practice as well. So you had mentioned that you make a lot more doing the clinical work compared to doing the advising work, right? And you can even offer that as well as justification for why you're charging the way you do. And then if you're someone who has experience as a founder, that can be very valuable to these startups as well. But in a lot of cases, for example, for me, like I would usually just offer things like clinical knowledge and maybe just experience evaluating startups as a LP to VC funds, for instance. So there's many different ways you can contribute. And one suggestion I can give to your listeners is if you're looking to kind of get into this, I've heard about Halo Health. They're operating mostly in Canada. Maybe they're branching out a little bit into the United States as well. But I see that they also have a very strong focus in healthcare startups.
Yeah, that a very, very interesting point there. So, some people may be wondering, like, how do I even get started here? I know the company that I had been in touch with was called Third Bridge, and they were quite flexible in terms of compensation and opportunities available. But again, for myself, I decided at this point in time, maybe not. But Steph, I don't know if you know of other companies, but where do people actually start to figure out how to navigate this? Like, is there like a site they can go to learn about, which companies will seek the opinion of physicians and actually pay them for their time?
Yeah. So, for example, the Hill Health that I mentioned, they can also provide people like either as if you want to invest, they'll provide maybe the deal flow. But if you just want to advise, I've heard that they also offer advising opportunities as well. That might be a way to start. And then I guess people can just also start the way that I did too, right? By attending some of these tech focused conferences. There are many out there. And that's just a good way of just purely networking and just talking to people, meeting people and hearing about what they do. That's kind of the more like organic way, I guess. And then there's also other ones, I think Spring Activator as well. I think they also have like a healthcare focus to some of their startups too. So I think when you start looking, when you start talking to founders, that really will help open the doors to a lot of more opportunities around there as well.
Okay. Now, in your answer, you talked about venture capital. So maybe I'll just jump down a few spots on the list of kind of streams of income. But you mentioned also, I think, venture capital fund investments. Do you want to just touch on that so listeners can better understand what that's all about?
For sure. So maybe I can give a very brief overview. So venture capital, I actually didn't really consider it in my income stream because it's not something like a dividend, like that pays out, or it's not something like a grant that you can get every year, right? It's a very closed kind of fund. So I guess I'll classify it a little bit as quasi-philanthropic. And so what I mean by that is there are a lot of social impact funds out there that are also venture funds. So one that comes to mind might be like the Raven Indigenous Impact Fund, and that invests in Indigenous founders, female founders fund. So these are all providing like early stage funding. And in the whole, I guess maybe your listeners might want to know, like, how does venture capital fit in? So in the life cycle of a company, you have like, let's say you start a company, you might go to like angel investors, friends and family. Then you have like the early seed stage funding. Then you have like series A to et cetera. And then you might have the company might IPO or they get sold to, I don't know, private equity or something. So that's kind of where private equity comes in later stage. But early on in a company's development, that's where venture capital comes in. And so the reason why I say for me, it's not so much. I guess there is an investment component to it, but I call it quasi-philanthropic because there are also these impact funds. And one of them, I think your previous speaker, the one on philanthropy, he also talked about like Toronto Foundation. I think they also have some social impact funds as well. But it's not like you're just giving money to like donating money. You're helping someone who might be a BIPOC or a female founder, for instance, Indigenous founders, develop a company that can benefit their community, employ people from their community, and for the betterment of their community in general, right? So that's why I say that in some cases it can be quasi-philanthropic. I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it.
No, I think it's a good descriptor, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has ever described it that way, but that's kind of how I think about it, because in some cases it can be high risk, right? Because there's no quarterly statements. There's not a lot of historical information. And it has a lot of, so for example, where you would look for this, I mentioned it earlier. So like similar, you meet startup founders, not a lot of info there, right? Because some of them haven't really fully developed their companies yet. In order to invest in venture capital, you have to meet the criteria of being an accredited investor. And the definition of accredited investor may vary between Canada and the States. So for example, in Canada, just off the top of my head, I think it's kind of like before tax income of around 200,000 for, I believe, 2 years.
Yeah.
So a lot of doctors would actually meet that if they're like in their mid-career, for instance. You as an individual or with a spouse have to have net assets of more than 5 million. And this is or criteria, not and. I think you and or your spouse can own financial assets of more than 1 million. And this is before taxes, not including your personal home. Or if you're like an advisor, like a securities, like an advisor, financial advisor, or something like that. So I think those are the 4 criteria. I'd have to double check that if that's still the same. But generally speaking, you have to meet that to invest in some venture funds. There are some venture funds out there, I think, that they will just open it up to non-accredited investors as well. But you have to think about that a little bit, because if they're asking non-accredited investors, you might think about, okay, why is that, right? Is it because they're having a hard time raising capital from accredited investors? And then the other thing is you always want to ask about the materials. So, who's running the fund? What's their track record? What's the performance of what's been done? In terms of the fees, it's around like 2% of assets under management. That usually goes towards like various admin expenses. And then you also want to make sure to ask if this is 2% of the raised assets or invested assets. The reason why is because they can raise a pool of money and just have it sit there while they're looking for different startups or companies to invest in. So the money's collected, but it's not actually invested yet. Whereas invested assets, it's as it's implied. The difference between a venture fund compared to, say, like a mutual fund or something, it does have a performance fee. Some of them have like a 20% performance fee. So it's this kind of like as a reward if the returns are above the preferred return or hurdle rate. And that's usually around 8%.
Right.
And then a lot of the venture funds will have an ask. So sometimes it varies. But for example, they might say like minimum 250,000 that's collected over a period of time, like 24 months. And you have to make sure to check the offering memorandum if how often they'll collect those chunks of money from you. Is it every 4 months, 8 months? And then this is, I think, the downside, I would say, because your money might be locked in for around, let's say, 7 years, right? And you are legally required to come up with that money for the ask. And if you can't, that might result in punitive measures, like you lose your investor rights, you have to pay interest and things like that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So you might be wondering as a listener, like, why would I even do this, right? In some cases, the returns could be beneficial. In some cases, maybe not, right? So that's why initially I started off my answer with saying that it's quasi-philanthropic, because you are investing in a person, in maybe a group that has been traditionally marginalized from being included in the venture capital space, for instance, or being invested in general, and you want the success of that group. So it can also be from like an EDI perspective as well.
Yeah.
So I hope that kind of gives like a brief overview of what's...
Oh, yeah. Steph, I think that is a great overview for anyone who is curious and maybe wanting to learn a bit more. It really is. Now, maybe let's pivot to more traditional investments. So our traditional investments will result in different forms of income, some interest, sometimes dividends. And then also there's the capital gain. And I'll be honest, I went through a phase where I was not dividend obsessed, but I think the dividends just gave me a bit more comfort, especially in an environment when the markets were in decline. But now what I've kind of focused on is just my total return and the long term. Although I will say that it would be nice to have a certain amount of dividend income later on in life that I can tap into for my personal expenses, traveling, whatnot, when I'm kind of winding down from clinical practice. But how do you think about this? Like, do you want a certain amount of passive income, maybe dividend income, or do you also kind of focus on the total return? And do you have a plan to maybe withdraw certain chunks of your portfolio at a certain point in time? Like, how do you think about all this?
Yeah, I think like what you mentioned kind of reminds me of some of the stuff I read on Reddit, where there's a lot of Canadians who are a big fan of dividend aristocrats. And I think for me personally, I don't really invest in a stock just because it pays a high dividend. I aim to invest in great companies. And if they happen to pay a dividend, that's great. But I don't necessarily like seek that out. So like, let me just think of a company that comes to mind. So for example, like Algonquin Power or Enbridge, right? Those stocks pay like what, 8% dividend or something like that?
Exactly.
And like, let's say you're just buying it for the dividend. I mean, yeah, it's 8% dividend. That's great. But then you look at the share price, it's not doing so well. And the thing is, I don't own these stocks, so I haven't looked at their like debt to equity ratio. But if you're in a company that's in a lot of debt and you're still raising your dividends, it makes you question, why are they doing that? Isn't that like not good for the health of the company itself? So those are just some things you want to think about when you're just looking at like a lot of the Canadian companies that pay high dividends. The other thing you want to think about is, let's say if it's in a non-registered account, so non-TFSA, RSP, et cetera. When you look at things like out of things like interest, capital gains, and dividends, which one would you say is the most tax efficient, right? That's another factor that you might want to think about when choosing the investment as well. So I'm not really a dividend investor exactly per se. I just kind of think about, the company itself and based on where I put that stock, is it beneficial from like a taxation perspective?
Yeah, I think that's really sound. To be honest, I now kind of focus on, I mean, some dividend is nice, but if a company has a dividend of more than 5%, I really have to understand, like, why is that the case? And is that dividend going to be safe? I would more often actually tend to invest in a company that pays a lower dividend, but that dividend is growing at a faster clip, because that can signify some underlying health in the financials of the company. So yeah, total return in the long term is kind of my focus as well. Before we dive into social media, actually, you know what? No, I want the next one to be your social media. So we've
Okay.
gone over multiple streams of income.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah. There's a lot now, but you're well known on YouTube and on Instagram with your handle Breaking Bad Debt. You're putting out amazing content, and I just want to know, like, does this result in any kind of income for you? And if it does, I think that's a good thing because you're adding value to people's lives. So want to get your take on social media.
Yeah. So when I started Breaking Bad Debt, it was initially on Instagram and then YouTube followed after. It was actually like the reason why I didn't initially include it in a source of income is because it wasn't meant to be a source of income. It was just like a fun way to track my journey paying off my med school debts and then to advocate for living frugally in a platform where a lot of Instagrammers were posting about like expensive things. And then when I started putting these lectures on YouTube as a way for not just U of T students to watch it, but students all over, I just thought, okay, maybe that was just it's just a fun way to, share my lectures with other people. And I actually never monetized YouTube for the longest time because I didn't want to be having a lecture recording and then in the middle there's like an ad for FTX or something like that. But then YouTube changed their policy a couple years ago, maybe like 1.5 years ago, and they said that they'll just put ads on your videos regardless of whether you've monetized them or not. So then I was like, okay, so if in that case, I'll just turn on monetization, which actually gives me control as to where those ads are going to be placed. So that way they're not like interrupting like midway in a lecture with something about cryptocurrency or something.
Yeah.
And then I would say in terms of the amount that I make from AdSense, it's not that much. It's kind of just covers my public transit fare every month. So anywhere between like $50 to $70. And I would say it also depends on your niche as well. So I interviewed Violin MD about her career as an like actual YouTuber. And her niche is a completely different niche, whereas my niche is finance. And with the financial niche, the CPM or cost per mil or cost per 1,000 views, that maybe might be higher than say, let's say like a healthcare niche, which might be what a lot of doctors might go into. But that's not where I think a lot of traditional YouTubers might make their income. A lot of times they can do brand partnerships where they have an ad embedded in their video. But then again, like, this can be a little bit risky because of what happened with FTX. Like they paid thousands, maybe 100,000s to be a brand partner with a lot of financial YouTubers. And in the end, these YouTubers got called out because they were promoting something that actually wasn't good for the investor, like FTX. So I've kind of declined a lot of those type of brand partners just to keep the content bias free. And also because I just don't invest in crypto myself. So I wouldn't promote something like that to viewers. So I guess in podcasting, maybe it might be a little bit different because you don't have like what YouTubers call CPM, right?
Right.
So maybe it might be interesting for you to talk about it as well.
Yeah, I could talk about that too. And so for the most part, I've also tried very hard to stay bias free. So if I'm interviewing somebody on a certain financial topic, there will be no ads or no sale pitch related to that topic. That's important to me because I want the focus of each episode on the podcast to remain educational because there is a lot for us to learn. So that's focus number one. But now that the podcast has been growing, one small source of income, and it is nominal, is speaking engagements. So I will be invited from time to time to speak and educate physicians on basic financial literacy and my experiences. And so now I'm getting to the spot where I'm beginning to feel a little bit more comfortable just having the conversation. Like, is the group open to paying? Is there some kind of stipend associated with this process? And what I found is that they're more than happy to have the conversation because, as you've said, if you're giving up your clinical time and adding value in a different way, I think that's a fair consideration. So that is one way. Now, another way I have generated some value for myself was actually one of my recent episodes where I really will stick to my rule of only endorsing products that I use myself or I would use myself and have benefited from. So one example was on one of my recent episodes, I did share a few links to a couple of the credit cards that I've been using for some time and benefiting. And I will give a shout out to some of the listeners because I know a few people probably did sign up using my links. And so what that did was that gave me a few travel points that I could put to use should the need come up. So it's not like direct financial income, but there can be a small benefit that one could generate for themselves that way. But going forward, yes, I am getting some more requests to take part in ads. But for me, it has to be something that I use myself or I would use myself and something that I think would benefit my listener base as a whole. And it's very heavy on physicians. So things that would benefit physicians. So I'm becoming more open to it, but it has to be approached delicately. And I think in an ethical way. Like for me, if I can do it in an ethical way and add value, then I think it's reasonable to think about. So that's my summary for podcasting to date and kind of what I'm thinking about going forward.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it can actually end up developing into a significant source of income. It's just not something I've had the time yet. Maybe in the future, I don't know. But I remember this year when I was at Elevate Fest, which is like a tech conference. Unlike a lot of the previous years, a large portion of the conference this year was actually dedicated to content creators. So they had like YouTubers, TikTokers, the head of YouTube Canada was there. And if you might wonder, like, why is there such a focus on content creators at a tech conference? And the rationale is that content creators are kind of like startup founders too. Some of them are building a brand. They might run a small business, like they might have employees. They might have certain teams doing this and that. And so it's also kind of like what I mentioned earlier, where you might be starting to develop a system in place that runs very efficiently and smoothly to kind of grow that startup that might be your podcast or might be my YouTube channel and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Steph, I do want to touch on this, but maybe a bit more superficially. So your next stream of income, real estate investing. I know you had mentioned that this was a type of investment that you over the years have enjoyed. And now I guess I'm just curious, like, where are you at with real estate investing and, at these rates? Is it a focus moving forward? I know you have a lot going on in your life. You and Colin this year got married as well. There's lots going on. Congratulations, by the way.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Congratulations. That's wonderful. Yeah, I'm curious where you're at with real estate investing.
Yeah, so I've been following very closely in the news around the current climate in real estate. And, there's been a lot of talk in the news around Canada's GDP stagnating. And even for the last 2 quarters, sometimes some reports are saying that there's a slight GDP decline. And basically, the definition of a recession is when you see a GDP decline for 2 quarters. So we don't know what's going to happen right now. But my answer is right now, I am not prioritizing it in today's climate, as it can be a risky climate when there's talks of a potential recession that we're heading into. And I didn't want to be in like a high debt position heading into a potential recession. So I just didn't want to be catching a falling knife. I thought another thing that I thought might be interesting to mention is I've been kind of working on a lecture that looks at the investing habits of the top 0.01% of wealth. And some research that's coming out of a 2023 report from the Capgemini Research Institute is showing that what high net worth individuals are doing is that they're allocating a bigger proportion of their portfolio just this year towards cash and cash equivalents. And that was an increase in 10% from their portfolio last year. And so if you're looking at what some of these high net worth people are doing, not really putting a lot into real estate at this time, it might potentially be a way to see what you can also be doing as well and seeing how their financial managers are managing their portfolios.
That is interesting. So do you mean like, for example, a high interest ETF type of thing? So something like that? Like is that what you mean by cash
That could
equivalent?
be
Yeah.
an example. It could,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Or it can just be like they're holding cash. Yeah, so high interest ETF. There could be just your traditional like GICs, which are actually like some of them are like 4.9% interest right now, and some of the high interest savings account too are also have pretty high interest that are paying out as well. So I'm thinking maybe the reasoning behind that strategy for a lot of these individuals might be because they're waiting on the sidelines and holding cash is a safe position right now, especially if they notice that there might be some good investing opportunities coming out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Only thing I'll mention on that is I was fortunate to attend a real estate investment event in the last few weeks, and one of Canada's economists was there, just kind of talking about the economic outlook and what they foresee. So, what's really interesting is I heard a stat that one third of Canadians rent, one third of Canadians have a home and have essentially paid off the mortgage, and the other third are on a mortgage. So, it's actually maybe less than we think, but right now, with people renewing, about one third of mortgages have renewed and the other two thirds have yet to renew. So with that information in mind, their forecast was that they foresee another 5 to 10% national decline in housing prices. So to your point of people maybe waiting on the sidelines, it's interesting. That's a view that I also share. I could definitely see a bit more pain in 2024, but I encourage people not to listen to a random guy with a shaved head on a podcast. I always say that, like, just don't listen to what I say. I find that directly owning properties, again, it involves more time. If you're willing to put in that time and you do it the right way at the right time, you can be rewarded. But I'm starting to move away from owning properties and doing things more passively now because I do value my time. Now, Steph, last but certainly not least, the Physician Financial Wellness Conference. This is the third year now, right, that you're running this?
That's right.
Yeah. I think it's great that you've kept up with it. And my understanding is that this is essentially philanthropic, but just kind of talk to us a bit about maybe what inspired you to do it. And yeah, I mean, it's a very nominal cost to attend such a financial resource of information. Tell us a bit about this event.
Yeah, for sure. So I thought that while I am still young, I want to be able to be more engaged in philanthropy because being on nonprofit boards, I've seen a lot of people leave donations of like 700,000 plus to a million. But after they've died, they've left their estate to a certain charity, for instance, and they don't even get to see the true impact of the amount that they've accumulated throughout their life. And so I thought, okay, what is one way that, I can make significant donations while I'm still young, but also still see the impact of those donations? And so I thought maybe, with the audience that I've built up through YouTube and Instagram, with the students that I know who have a strong interest in financial literacy, maybe this is a way for all of us to work together to raise money for causes that further the financial initiative, financial literacy and education for other physicians, for medical students to also afford medical school as well. So I think like the conference itself, not only do we try to make it accessible by having like low cost to attend, the ticket sales also go towards initiatives such as financial education initiatives, covering students to present their research on financial literacy and on quality improvement for the conference at traditional conferences to bring it more in the mainstream. Because as a researcher, one issue that I've faced is it's so hard to get grants. It's so hard to have, traditional systems see the legitimacy of and the importance of financial literacy in what would otherwise be a very high debt career like medicine. So, having those small ways of, having our students publish research and publish op-eds and healthy debates, presenting research at traditional education conferences, these are all ways of getting the whole idea and the importance of financial literacy out into the greater medical community, but also just for a good cause too. So last year's proceeds, we used that to set up an endowment fund that my partner Colin and I also contributed to as well, to bring it to endowment level. And that went to a student who is an international student. And she actually had to crowdsource her tuition because she wasn't able to afford her international tuition. And so that was one way of supporting a medical student with financial need who also has engaged in improving the financial literacy and financial opportunities for other students as well. So that was another, way of, while still young, getting to actually see the direct impact of some of the of the philanthropic initiatives that you've created. But also, it's a great way to just get engaged with medical students and residents who are part of the conference planning committee, because you're working together. It's not hierarchical. You're all kind of on the same page, and you're getting medical students and residents involved early in their own financial literacy as well. It's not something just for staff physicians. And interestingly, this year, we've noticed a huge uptick in the attendee numbers for medical students and residents.
Great news,
compared to
yeah.
previous years, once we got residents and medical students involved as part of the part of the conference planning committee as well.
That's amazing news. I think this is a wonderful endeavor. I'm really happy that you're going on with this year after year. And I think it's just a great way, Steph, to bring our medical community together for a great cause each and every year. So yeah. that's amazing. And I'm happy to see the uptick, especially with the younger registrant. So Steph, that is a great overview of kind of how you structure your life, the various pursuits and the various sources of income. I know that there's going to be a lot of useful information here for our listeners. And as always, I want to thank you for everything that you do on your time to educate people and bring value to the world. And thanks for making time for me today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yatin.
Okay, take care. Guys, I learned a lot talking with Steph in this series of interviews. I mean, she's so beyond her years, and I really do believe that her words come with so much wisdom. And I think of all her streams of income, what fascinated me the most was sitting on a board of directors and acquiring that type of knowledge. That is something I would love to do at some point in my future. Of course, it would have to be a cause that I'm truly passionate about and an area that I really want to have a meaningful change. So we will see what the future has in store. But I encourage everybody, as the new year is upon us, take some time to reflect on what your near, mid, and long-term goals are going to be. Maybe even take it one step further and write these goals down on paper. Make it a contract. And then think about what are the steps that you're going to have to take to make this all a possibility. What's the knowledge that you'll have to acquire? What are the books that you're going to have to read? Who are the people that you're going to have to network with? The best time to think about this is today, because when the new year starts, it gets busy and sometimes you feel like you're a step behind. So guys, the holidays are upon us. I want to wish everybody a wonderful holiday season with your friends, family, and loved ones. I hope it's amazing for all of you. And I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey and supporting me. Please continue to share the podcast with people in your network if you feel that it is of value. And of course, we're grateful for ratings and reviews. Enjoy the holidays, stay well, stay savvy, and we will see you soon.